Fight!
Welcome back to Vivid Noise. The late 90s and very early 2000s was that weird time when console and PC games weren't completely separated, but they didn't exactly exist in parallel either, like they mostly do today. You usually got knockoffs of games from one system on the other, typically console games imitated on PC, and whenever you did get a cross-platform game, the differences could range from purely technical to the entire game being completely different in controls, structure, and content. Due to the giant gap in technical specifications and input devices, certain genres of games had more trouble making the transition than others, and a prime example would be the first-person shooter. While the FPS genre eventually found its stride on consoles, most notably during the 7th generation, there are countless examples of ports or even exclusives that exist purely to try and figure out how to effectively design around the limitations of a controller. And then, Halo showed up and did for console FPS what Mario 64 did for 3D platformers. With that said, today I want to focus on Quake Free Revolution, which came out mere months before that, and talk about the changes that it made in order to not only adapt to the new input method, but the expected design sensibilities of a console game. And speaking of input method, here's the weird thing about this game. Although it predates Halo and the standardization of dual analog, you do in fact have the option to play the game that way via the advanced controller preset. But despite the option, I still found the game plenty playable using the default setup, which essentially mimics the controls found in id Software's own Doom. You move forward and backward with the same stick you used to look left and right. It's a very archaic method of controlling a first-person game, but there's a few things about this game, be it intentional or not, that allow this control scheme to feel pretty natural, all things considered. We've mainly got the level design and weapon loadout to thank for that. While Quake Free and everything about it was initially designed with mouse and keyboard in mind, the level of precision you need for the basic game loop is just forgiving enough that aiming with a controller isn't as big of an issue as you might have feared. Your weapons have a good amount of leeway in terms of their bullet spread, and the levels are designed in such a way as to make most direct combat encounters at medium to close range. While there is a fair amount of verticality to the level geometry, most of your firefights will occur on sections of flat ground, eliminating the need to aim vertically. I must stress that this is in no way comparable to the gameplay of the original Quake Free. Most of the standard movement tech you would expect is almost completely non-viable, but Revolution's marriage of design and control is enough to offer a fun, decisively arcade-like experience. I find it quite interesting how different this game is compared to the respective port of its closest competitor, Unreal Tournament. That game's PS2 port did everything that it could to emulate the PC experience, from the minimal single player down to even keyboard and mouse support. Quake Free Revolution, on the other hand, changes so much about the presentation, single player experience, and overall content on offer that you can really tell they were trying to target a console audience, as opposed to, I guess, the likes PC games but doesn't have a proper setup crowd. So what about that single player experience? Well, to call it more fleshed out than the PC original would be an understatement. This is a straight up overhaul. You probably don't even remember since the multiplayer really was the focus in the original, but let me just remind you that Quake Free's original campaign was just a series of deathmatch maps split into tiers, all ending on a 1v1. It existed purely to teach you how WASD works, since that was actually pretty new at the time, and to get you familiar with all of the maps, only for like 3 of them to be used competitively. Revolution isn't interested in simply being a tutorial. First of all, instead of just deathmatch, all of the different game modes are sprinkled in throughout the experience. Most of these modes are variations of or ripped directly from the original and Team Arena, although there is one that stands out as particularly exciting and memorable. That mode would have to be Elimination, which is in some ways similar to Unreal Tournament's Last Man Standing, except there are 2 flavors of it. You can either have a free-for-all where everyone has a limited number of lives, so it's basically a deathmatch but with more consequences for getting fragged, or it can be like Super Smash Bros. Melee's All-Star mode, where you have to defeat several opponents 1v1 with a limited amount of lives. This mode doesn't do anything groundbreaking, I just thought it was a fitting addition, and it definitely rounds out the game modes you experienced during the single player. Even just the addition of different match conditions would have been an improvement over the original, but Bullfrog went ahead and added even more to make Revolution a more complete solo experience. I'm talking about the playable characters. Yes, characters, not skins. At the start of the single player mode, you get to pick between, I think, 3 characters that don't just look different, but have differing base stats and stat potential. That means that not not only will your choice affect your max health, resistance to damage, and speed, but it will also determine how much better those stats can be in the future. I chose Damia since she had the best potential for max health, and seeing as the generous weapon hitboxes also apply to your opponents, I figured it might as well save myself the hassle of dodging. That's not to say it's impossible or anything, the controls really are intuitive, especially the strafing, which by default is mapped to the shoulder buttons. It's just that the game moves so fast that I often focus more on just killing my opponent before they drain my health bar. It's honestly how I play these kind of games on PC as well. I think the only weapon it doesn't make the shift from mouse to controller is the railgun, since it retains its sniper-esque qualities of the original, therefore requiring significantly more precision than any other weapon. At close range this isn't really a problem, but that defeats the whole point of the railgun to begin with. Getting back to the character selection, I'm particularly fond of the small detail they added to accompany the stat leveling system. Every few upgrades or so, your character skin will change to look more and more technologically augmented, almost akin to that of Strogification from Quake 4. I don't know, that kind of stuff just makes me happy, since it's such a needless detail for a first-person game. You're not exactly going to be looking at your character a whole lot, so why even bother? Okay, they probably just had some extra multiplayer skins left over and decided to incorporate them into the single player, but you know, the effect did not go unnoticed. Something that often does go unnoticed, however, relates to this game on a more meta level. I'm talking about the way it presents itself versus not only the PC original, but also other console shooters. I really don't know why more people don't talk about this, because it's quite a fun topic to delve into. Basically, I've noticed that there has always existed a certain level of distinction between how PC games present themselves and how console exclusives do it. Multi-platform games mostly avoid this though. This isn't something isolated to the early 2000s, it still happens, especially in the indie scene. Essentially, there is a very defined difference in the emphasis on production value between PC-only titles and console titles. I'm not talking about graphical fidelity, although obviously PC is better 90% of the time. I'm talking about the stuff not determined by your graphics card. Menus, voice acting, cutscenes, depth of the storylines, soundtrack, you know, that sort of stuff. When Quake 3 came out, it may have been very solid looking in-game, but its menus had no music and were insanely basic, its sound design was fairly utilitarian with little flair, and the in-game HUD had no style whatsoever, and the fonts looked like they were just left at default. If you compare it to, say, Medal of Honor on PS1, it looks amateurish by comparison in all but texture resolution and poly counts. In fact, most console alternatives to PC games at that time had the upper hand when it came to that aspect of the presentation. I've always had this belief that PC gamers generally don't expect as much when it comes to that sort of stuff compared to console players. They tend to be a little more no-nonsense and just want to jump straight into the core of the game, and since their games usually look much better in real time compared to the consoles, they don't need any supplementary presentation to make up for any hardware limitations. I guess it also helps that since they were already used to navigating a typical user interface like that of Windows, the developers could get away with not really having to streamline any of their menus, since they can just make them look like a series of pop-up windows. Think Unreal Tournament, or even to an extent Morrowind. On the other hand, console players seem to value a better sense of style in their menus, for example, maybe a richer story, pre-rendered cutscenes to make up for the in-game graphics and give you an idea as to what you're actually supposed to be looking at, and just a higher level of polish all around. Over time, these two worlds have grown closer. Our expectations of a PC game menu are usually quite a bit higher than Windows 98 SE, but I find that you can still get away with more on PC, especially in early access or lower budget indie games. You would never see something like Universe Sandbox on console, not necessarily because a PS5 couldn't run it, it probably could actually, but just because of the kind of game that it is and the way that you go about interacting with it. Hardcore racing simulations are still more popular on PC, not because they really need all of that horsepower, but because purely statistically, console users are far less likely to own the right setup to play that kind of game effectively. And speaking of the right setup, Quake 3 Revolution doesn't have mouse and keyboard support unlike its rival, but due to all of the aforementioned design choices and accommodations, I still think it's an enjoyable, more single-player friendly arena shooter experience. You don't play this game for the same reason you do the original, and you also don't play it for the same reasons you would a more contemporary console FPS. It has its own thing going on, and I had a pretty good time for the few hours that I spent with it. If you've somehow never played the original, go and play that first. But if you have and you're curious as to what this game is actually like, outside of this video, pop it in ISO and try it out, because it's actually pretty fun. And once again, thank you so much for watching another episode of Vivid Noise. I'll see you guys next time.